The day America committed suicide hook, first 60 seconds, tilde 140 words, 620,000 bodies. If you stacked them head to toe, the line of corpses would stretch from Washington, D.C., all the way to the heart of Atlanta. This wasn't a war fought against a foreign invader or a distant empire. This was a suicide pact signed in blood. It is 4:30 a.m. April 12, 1861. A single mortar shell whistles through the black Charleston sky, tracing a glowing red arc before detonating directly over Fort Sumter. It isn't just a shell, it is a signal. For 34 hours, 3,000 rounds of screaming iron turned the sky into a canopy of fire. Men who studied at West Point together, who toasted at each other's weddings, are now calculating the math required to blow each other's heads off. The United States is no longer a country, it is a crime scene, but the horror was only beginning. Section 1, the picnic at the Slaughterhouse. The North thought it would be over by lunch. When President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, he only asked for 90 days of service. He thought that was all the time he needed to crush the Southern rebellion and bring the wayward states back into the fold. In the South, the fire eaters boasted that a single Confederate could whip 10 Yankees before breakfast. The arrogance was lethal. By July 1861, the two amateur armies collided at a small stream called Bull Run. It wasn't just soldiers who showed up. The Washington elite treated the battle like a Sunday social. Senators, socialites, and families in horse-drawn carriages packed picnic baskets with cold chicken and champagne, driving out to the hillsides of Manassas to watch the show. They expected a pageant of colorful uniforms and quick glory. What they got was the smell of burning hair and the sound of men screaming for their mothers. The Union line surged forward, nearly breaking the Confederate defense, until they saw a man standing motionless amidst the chaos. General Bernard B. shouted to his retreating men, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." Thomas Stonewall Jackson didn't flinch. His lead filled the air. His brigade held the line, and then they did something that would haunt the nightmares of Northern soldiers for 4 years. They let out the rebel yell, a high-pitched, terrifying scream that sounded like a cross between a banshee and a circular saw. The Union line didn't just retreat, it disintegrated. The Grand Army turned and ran, trampling the picnic baskets of the horrified socialites. Carriages overturned. Senators were nearly captured. The road back to D.C. was a choked mess of discarded muskets, half-eaten sandwiches, and terrified civilians. The North realized with a cold shiver that this wasn't a 90-day skirmish. It was an existential struggle against an enemy that would rather burn the continent to the ground than surrender their way of life. Lincoln sat in the White House, staring at the reports, realizing he was the commander-in-chief of a nation that was rapidly bleeding out. He needed a general who could win, but all he had were men who were terrified of the ghost of Robert E. Lee. And then the technology of death caught up to the tactics of the Napoleonic era, turning every battlefield into a literal meat grinder. Section 2, the geometry of the Grave War changed in 1862. It stopped being about gallantry and started being about physics. The culprit was a small, conical piece of lead called the Minié ball. Before this, muskets were notoriously inaccurate. You couldn't hit a barn door at 100 yards. But the Minié ball expanded into the rifling of the barrel, spinning with the deadly precision of a modern sniper rifle. It didn't just pierce the skin. When it hit human bone, it didn't crack it, it pulverized it into cornmeal. Surgeons couldn't repair these wounds, they didn't even try. The primary tool of the Civil War doctor wasn't a scalpel, it was a bone saw. Outside every field hospital, the heap became a standard sight. A literal pile of amputated arms and legs reaching as high as a man's waist, buzzing with black flies in the summer heat. There were no antibiotics, there was no understanding of germs. Men survived the lead only to die from the surgical touch of a doctor who hadn't washed his hands in 3 days. In the East, Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was a man of contradictions, a man who hated secession but loved his home state of Virginia more than his country. He was a gambler. He took an inferior force and began dismantling Union generals like they were children. At the 7 Days battles, he drove the hesitant George McClellan away from the gates of Richmond. Lee was an artist of the battlefield, but his canvas was soaked in the blood of his own men. He knew the South couldn't win a long war of attrition. He needed a knockout blow, he needed to take the war to the North. In September 1862, Lee crossed the Potomac. He was looking for a decisive victory on Northern soil to force Lincoln to the bargaining table. The two armies met at Sharpsburg, Maryland, along the banks of Antietam Creek. It remains the bloodiest single day in American history. In just 12 hours, 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. In a place called the Sunken Road, the bodies were piled so thick that soldiers could walk for 100 yards without their feet ever touching the ground. The air was so thick with lead that it mowed down stalks of corn like a giant invisible scythe. Lee's invasion was halted, but the cost was a generation of young men. Lincoln had the victory he needed, but he used it to drop a political nuclear bomb that would change the very DNA of the conflict. This was no longer just a war to save a map. It was about to become a crusade to destroy an entire civilization's social order. Section 3, the Altar of Antietam. By the spring of 1862, the romantic notion of a short, glorious conflict had evaporated in the sulphurous smoke of Shiloh. In the woods of Tennessee, Ulysses S. Grant learned a lesson that would define the rest of the war. The Confederacy would not be conquered, it had to be consumed. Over 2 days, 23,000 men fell, more than in all previous American wars combined. Grant remarked that the field was so covered in dead that one could have walked across the clearing on bodies without ever touching the ground. But as the West bled, the East remained paralyzed. General George McClellan, the Union's young Napoleon, possessed a magnificent army but lacked the arithmetic for slaughter. He hesitated before Richmond, allowing a new commander to seize the initiative. Robert E. Lee, a man who viewed audacity as his only currency, took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee didn't just defend, he struck. Lee's first invasion of the North in September 1862 brought the war to a narrow creek in Maryland called Antietam. On September 17, the sun rose on the single bloodiest day in American history. The fighting was visceral, concentrated in 3 distinct hells: the cornfield, where the stalks were cut as closely as if by a knife; the sunken road, soon renamed Bloody Lane as it filled with a literal carpet of gray corpses; and Burnside's Bridge, where the water ran red. Private David Thompson of the 9th New York described the sensation. The air was full of the hiss of bullets and the hurtling of grape shot. It was a great tumbling together of all things. By sunset, 2,700 men were dead, wounded, or missing. Antietam was a tactical draw but a strategic earthquake. It gave Abraham Lincoln the political capital to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This was no longer a war to merely restore the status quo. It was now a crusade to dismantle the very architecture of the South. "If my name ever goes into history," Lincoln said as he signed the document, "it will be for this act." The war had been rebranded as a struggle for human liberty, making it diplomatically impossible for Britain or France to intervene on behalf of the slave-holding South. Yet as the ink dried, Lee was already regrouping. The South's greatest tactical victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville were yet to come, and the Union's resolve was fraying at the seams. Lincoln's generals were failing him, and the North was growing weary of the butcher's bill. The tide was about to reach its highest, most terrifying point. Section 4, the high water mark 1863, was the year of the hinge. In the North, Lee's army, emboldened by a stunning victory at Chancellorsville, despite the loss of the legendary Stonewall Jackson, marched once more into Pennsylvania. Lee sought a decisive blow on Northern soil to force a peace treaty. Simultaneously, in the West, Grant had trapped a Confederate army in the riverside fortress of Vicksburg. The fate of the Republic hung on 2 points of a compass. On July 1, 1863, the vanguard of both armies collided at a crossroads town called Gettysburg. For 3 days, 160,000 men struggled across rocky hills and peach orchards. The climax came on July 3 with Pickett's charge. Under a blistering sun, 12,000 Confederates marched across a mile of open field into the concentrated fire of Union cannons. It was a magnificent suicidal parade. Watching his shattered ranks return, Lee took the blame himself, moaning, "It is all my fault." As Lee retreated from the heights of Pennsylvania, the telegraph wires hummed with even more devastating news from the Mississippi. On July 4, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The Father of Waters now flowed unvexed to the sea, as Lincoln put it. The Confederacy was physically severed in half. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were cut off from the rebellion. The double blow of Gettysburg and Vicksburg was the death knell of the Southern cause, though the South refused to hear it. The war shifted into a new, darker phase. The North found its champion in Grant, whom Lincoln promoted to general-in-chief. Grant understood what his predecessors did not. Lee's army was the objective, not Richmond. Grant moved east to face Lee directly, initiating the Overland Campaign, the most relentless period of sustained combat ever seen on the continent. In the dense thickets of the wilderness, the woods caught fire, burning wounded men alive as they lay trapped in the undergrowth. Grant did not retreat after a defeat. He moved by the left flank deeper into Virginia. When his staff reminded him of the mounting casualties, Grant replied, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The war of maneuver was over, the war of attrition had begun. But while Grant pinned Lee in a death grip at the siege of Petersburg, a different kind of fire was being prepared in the West. William Tecumseh Sherman was eyeing Atlanta, ready to prove that war was not just a clash of armies, but a psychological war against a civilian population's will to resist. Section 5. The hard hand of war. In late 1864, the South began to burn. William Tecumseh Sherman, believing that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it, captured Atlanta and then cut his supply lines for his march to the sea. His 60,000 soldiers carved a 60-mile-wide path of destruction through the heart of Georgia, destroying railroads, seizing livestock, and torching anything of military value. "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people," Sherman declared. He wasn't just killing soldiers, he was killing the Southern dream of independence. By the time he reached Savannah, the Southern economy was a charred ruin. In the North, this victory secured Lincoln's re-election, ensuring the war would be fought to the bitter end. The noose was tightening around Lee's neck at Petersburg, where men lived in trenches for 9 months, a haunting preview of the First World War. By April 1865, the Confederate lines finally snapped. Richmond fell, and as the Confederate government fled, they set fire to their own capital. Lee's army, reduced to starving ghosts, attempted to escape west, but Grant's cavalry was faster. At Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, the two giants met. Lee, in his finest dress uniform, and Grant, splattered with mud in a private's blouse, negotiated the end. Grant offered generous terms. The Southerners could keep their horses for the spring plowing and go home. "The war is over," Grant told his men as they began to cheer. "The rebels are our countrymen again." The surrender was a moment of profound dignity, yet the peace was immediately stained by blood. 5 days later, on Good Friday, the celebratory mood was shattered. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had navigated the storm, was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. The president's death deprived the nation of its great emancipator at the very moment he was needed most to oversee the healing of the fractured Union. The South had been defeated, slavery had been abolished, and the central government had been vindicated. But the cost was a deep, jagged scar across the American soul. As the funeral train carried Lincoln back to Illinois, the country faced a new, uncertain reality. The war had settled the question of whether the United States was a collection of sovereign states or a single nation. But the question of how that nation would treat its newly freed citizens remained an open, bleeding wound. Conclusion: the American Civil War did more than just preserve a map, it forged a new identity. Before 1861, people said the United States are asterisk. After 1865, they said the United States is asterisk. The conflict claimed over 620,000 lives, roughly 2% of the population, leaving an empty chair at nearly every table in the land. The landscape was littered with more than just lead and iron. It was littered with the wreckage of an old world. The institution of slavery, which had poisoned the Republic's founding, was finally purged by fire, though the struggle for true equality was only just beginning. The final image of the war is not one of a charging cavalry or a sinking ship, but of a veteran, North or South, returning to a farm that was no longer the same in a country that had finally grown up. The ghosts of Gettysburg and Shiloh still whisper in the wind, reminding us that the price of union was paid in the blood of brothers. Outro: if this story moved you, subscribe to Chronicles of History. New documentary every week. Drop a comment, what moment shocked you most? The next video is on screen right now.